The night over Iron Bottom Sound was as black as engine oil, a humid, oppressive darkness that swallowed light and sound. For the American sailors patrolling the narrow strait between Guadalcanal and the Florida Islands, these waters had already earned their grim reputation. It was a nautical graveyard where naval battles were savage, chaotic, and almost always fought in the blinding dark. Tonight was no different. The flash of American guns ripped the darkness apart, hurling shells at distant, ghost-like silhouettes of Japanese warships. On the bridges of the cruisers and destroyers, commanders watched the fiery arcs of their salvations, calculating trajectories and ordering course corrections. Everything was proceeding according to the brutal logic of naval combat, until the logic shattered. A sudden, blinding flash blossomed on the horizon, but it wasn't the bloom of a shell landing. It was a geyser of flame and water erupting from the side of an American cruiser, a ship that should have been well outside the effective torpedo range of any known Japanese vessel. A phantom blow from an impossible distance. On the bridge of a nearby ship, disbelief turned to horror. Before the shock could even register, a second American ship was struck, convulsing as a cataclysmic blast tore through its hull. Panic flared in the combat information centers. Frantic questions flew over the comms circuits as commanders struggled to comprehend an attack that defied the known rules of engagement. Submarine, was the first desperate guess. But sonar operators reported no contacts, no telltale hum of electric motors in the deep. A minefield we didn't chart. It seemed impossible. They were in a well-trafficked channel. Could it be our own munitions? One officer wondered aloud in a hushed, horrified tone, some kind of catastrophic malfunction. This was a scene of terrifying confusion that played out in night battles throughout the Solomon Islands campaign. The violent destruction of the USS Helena, on July 6, 1943, was a brutal case in point. The cruiser was torn apart by torpedoes at a range American commanders considered entirely safe. The first hit sheared off her bow, and two more slammed into her midships, breaking the vessel's back. For the men in the water, clinging to debris amidst spreading oil slicks, the technical questions were meaningless. They only knew the terror of the unseen. Legends were born in those blood-warm waters, whispered by survivors with hollow eyes. A sailor who survived the sinking of the USS Northampton spoke of invisible strikes that came out of the suffocating darkness with no warning. Among the crews, rumors spread like wildfire, tales of ghost torpedoes that ran silently and without a wake, or of mysterious Japanese stealth submarines that could surface, fire, and vanish in seconds. They were fighting a ghost, an enemy whose weapon appeared to be a form of dark magic. But this was no specter. It was a marvel of deadly engineering, a secret weapon meticulously designed and jealously guarded. It had a name, the Type 93 oxygen torpedo. And for the American Navy, the education in its lethal capabilities had just begun. The genesis of this revolutionary weapon can be traced back to 1926, a period when the Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN, grappled with a stark reality. The Washington and London naval treaties had codified their naval inferiority, limiting Japan's capital ship tonnage to a fraction of that possessed by the United States and Great Britain. Unable to compete in sheer numbers, Japanese naval strategists embraced the concept of Kantai Kessen Dash, the decisive battle, a doctrine that relied on landing a single, overwhelming blow to cripple the enemy fleet. To achieve this, they needed a trump card, an asymmetrical weapon that could nullify the West's numerical superiority. The answer, they believed, lay in perfecting the torpedo. The catalyst for the project was a tantalizing, and ultimately false, piece of intelligence. Between 1926 and 1927, Captain Toshihide Oyagi, a Japanese observer in England, picked up rumors circulating within the Royal Navy. The whispers concerned Britain's new battleships, HMS Rodney and HMS Nelson Dash. They were said to be armed with revolutionary 24.5-inch torpedoes powered by enriched oxygen, a propellant that promised incredible range and speed. The rumors were untrue, a phantom menace born of speculation, but for the IJN, they were a spark of inspiration. If the British were developing such a weapon, Japan had to create a better one. The path, however, was fraught with danger. This was not Japan's first foray into the volatile world of oxygen propulsion. As early as 1917, Japanese engineers had experimented with oxygen-fueled torpedoes, only to abandon the project after a series of catastrophic explosions that turned test sites into infernos. They had learned a brutal lesson: pure oxygen is violently unforgiving. The core technical challenge was a deadly chemical dance. In any engine, lubricants are essential to prevent moving parts from seizing. But when compressed, pure oxygen comes into contact with even a minuscule amount of petroleum-based lubricant, it detonates with the force of a high-explosive shell. The early prototypes were, in effect, as dangerous to the ship launching them as they were to the enemy. Haunted by the ghost of past failures, a team of Japan's most brilliant naval engineers, working under a thick veil of secrecy, revisited the problem. The risk of premature detonation was the monster they had to tame. For years, they struggled with the fundamental conundrum: how to run a high-pressure engine without the lubricant that would cause it to self-destruct. The breakthrough came not from a new material, but from an ingenious new process. Their solution was elegant in its simplicity. They designed a system that would initiate the launch sequence using ordinary compressed air, a stable and reliable propellant. The compressed air would begin the engine cycle, purging the system and moving the pistons. Only after the engine was running smoothly and safely would a series of valves switch the fuel source, feeding pure oxygen directly into the combustion chamber. This two-stage ignition process completely isolated the volatile oxygen from the lubricated parts during the critical startup phase, solving the problem that had plagued them for over a decade. The development was a state secret of the highest order. Tests were conducted in remote locations, far from prying eyes. Even with the new system, accidents happened. Explosions still rocked the test ranges, a grim reminder of the power they were trying to bottle. But they persevered, relentlessly refining the engine and the warhead. Finally, in 1933, or, as it was marked in the Japanese imperial calendar, the year 2593, the weapon was officially adopted by the Imperial Japanese Navy. It was designated the Type 93 torpedo. To the engineers who built it and the sailors who would wield it, it was simply Sanso Jirai the oxygen torpedo. They had not just created a new weapon, they had given birth to a monster, a sea dragon that could run faster, farther, and with a more powerful bite than any other torpedo in the world. It was the key to their decisive battle strategy, a secret weapon designed to level the playing field and, when the time came, deliver a devastating, long-range blow from the dark. When the Type 93 torpedo was unleashed upon the Allied fleets, it was not merely an incremental improvement over existing torpedo technology, it was a quantum leap, a weapon so far beyond the established paradigms of naval warfare that its existence was initially dismissed as impossible. A side-by-side comparison with its primary American counterpart, the troubled Mark 15 torpedo, reveals a chasm in performance so vast it seems to belong to a different era of technology. To the American sailors who faced it, the Type 93 was less a piece of machinery and more a malevolent force of nature, and its technical data, once finally understood by Allied intelligence after the war, was nothing short of shocking. The sheer physical presence of the weapon was intimidating. The Type 93 was a behemoth, measuring 29.5 feet, 9 meters, in length with a diameter of 24 inches, 610 millimeters. It weighed in at a colossal 5,940 pounds, nearly 3 metric tons. But its most devastating feature was its warhead. It carried a payload of 1,080 pounds, 490 kilograms, of high explosive, a charge designed for maximum destructive effect. This figure becomes particularly chilling when placed in the context of American naval architecture. U.S. warship designers, operating on the prevailing understanding of torpedo capabilities, had engineered their cruisers and destroyers to withstand the impact of warheads in the 800 to 1,000 pound range. The Type 93's warhead was deliberately crafted to sit just above that threshold, ensuring that a successful hit would not just damage an American ship, but break its spine. By contrast, the American Mark 15 carried a significantly smaller 825-pound warhead. However, the true revolution of the Type 93 was its astonishing reach. The oxygen-fueled engine, a marvel of engineering that produced an incredible 520 horsepower, more than double the 240 horsepower of contemporary British torpedoes, gave it a range and speed that defied belief. The Type 93 could be set to run for 22,000 yards, 20 kilometers, at a blistering speed of 48 knots. If speed was sacrificed for range, it could travel an unbelievable 44,000 yards, 40 kilometers, at a still swift 36 knots. The performance of the American Mark 15 paled in comparison. At its absolute maximum setting, it could manage a mere 8,000 yards, nearly 3 times less than the Type 93's long-range setting. This disparity fundamentally altered the geometry of night battles. Japanese commanders could launch their torpedoes from a position of absolute safety, well outside the effective range of American guns, let alone American torpedoes. They could strike with impunity from over the horizon, turning entire sections of the sea into lethal, invisible kill zones. Compounding this overwhelming advantage in range and power was the Type 93's most terrifying characteristic, its stealth. Conventional torpedoes, including the Mark 15, were typically powered by steam or compressed air, which left a long, telltale trail of bubbles in their wake. A sharp-eyed lookout could spot this trail, giving a target ship precious seconds to take evasive action. The Type 93, however, was a ghost in the water. Its unique oxygen and kerosene propulsion system produced exhaust gases, primarily carbon dioxide, that were almost entirely soluble in seawater. The result was a weapon that was practically traceless. It left no wake of bubbles, no visible sign of its approach. It simply materialized out of the darkness as a cataclysmic explosion against a ship's hull. This combination of extreme range, a hull-shattering warhead, and unparalleled stealth was the devil's brew that made the Type 93 the most feared and misunderstood naval weapon of the Pacific War. The first full-scale, terrifying demonstration of the Type 93's power came in the pre-dawn blackness of August 9, 1942. In the waters that would soon be grimly christened Iron Bottom Sound, an Allied fleet stood guard over the nascent American beachhead on Guadalcanal. The force, comprised of American and Australian cruisers and destroyers, was confident, perhaps even complacent. The strategic thinking of the U.S. Navy held that a night engagement would be a gunfight, and the primary role of heavy cruisers was to use their powerful 8-inch guns to pound the enemy. Torpedoes were seen as the province of smaller, more nimble destroyers. The idea of a Japanese force of heavy cruisers steaming boldly into close quarters for a mass torpedo attack was tactically unthinkable. Shortly before 2 o'clock, the unthinkable happened. A powerful Japanese task force under Vice Admiral Genichi Mikawa, centered on his own heavy cruisers, swept around Savo Island, catching the Allied forces completely by surprise. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughter. The Japanese lookouts, honed by years of intense night training, spotted the Allied ships long before their own silhouettes were detected. Then, the long lances were unleashed. From ranges the Allied commanders couldn't fathom, waves of Type 93 torpedoes sliced silently through the water. The Australian heavy cruiser HMAS Canberra was struck first and mortally wounded. Then came the turn of the American cruisers. The USS Astoria Quincy and Vincennes were all ripped apart by a combination of torpedo hits and blistering gunfire. Within the space of a single hour, 4 Allied heavy cruisers were either sunk or left as blazing, helpless wrecks, destined for the bottom of the Sound. The Japanese, having delivered a devastating and precise blow, withdrew as swiftly as they had arrived, suffering only minor damage in return. The shock to the American command was profound and paralyzing. The loss of 4 capital ships in one night was a catastrophe on a scale not seen since Pearl Harbor. In the immediate aftermath, disbelief reigned. How could this have happened? The Japanese cruisers had engaged them, yes, but the devastation seemed disproportionate to a mere gun battle. The initial reports were a chaotic mix of speculation. The losses were so sudden and so complete that senior officers refused to believe they could have been inflicted by surface ships alone. Surely, they had stumbled into a meticulously laid minefield, or been the victims of a coordinated wolf pack attack by unseen submarines. The idea that Japanese cruisers had executed such a daring and lethal torpedo strike was dismissed. It simply did not fit within the rigid framework of American naval doctrine. The strategic consequences were immediate and dire. With its screening force shattered, the American transport fleet, crucial for supplying the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal, was forced to withdraw. The Marines were left stranded, their lifeline cut, exposed and vulnerable. The battle very nearly doomed the entire Guadalcanal campaign before it had truly begun. The sheer audacity of the Japanese operation left the American High Command scrambling for answers. The long and painful process of dissecting the disaster would take years. It was a moment of such historical gravity that it demanded a chronicler. This sentiment was perhaps best captured in a later, now famous anecdote concerning the formidable Admiral Ernest J. King, the U.S. Navy's irascible commander-in-chief. When the historian Samuel Eliot Morison was brought before him to discuss his ambitious plan to write a comprehensive history of the fleet's wartime operations, King, a man known for his secrecy and stern demeanor, initially fixed Morison with a grim stare. Then, a flicker of realization seemed to cross his face as he considered the scale of what had occurred at battles like Savo Island. "Ah," King reportedly grunted, a hint of weary acceptance in his voice, "so you're the fellow." The disaster was so complete, the shock so deep, that even the most tight-lipped admiral understood the need for someone to one day make sense of the incomprehensible. If the Battle of Savo Island was the bloody introduction to the long lance, the Battle of Tassafaronga was its masterclass in tactical devastation. By late 1942, the U.S. Navy was no longer naive. Equipped with superior radar that could pierce the darkest night, American task forces now felt they held the technological edge. On the night of November 30th, Task Force 67, an imposing force of 5 cruisers and 6 destroyers, steamed into Iron Bottom Sound with a clear mission, to intercept and annihilate another Tokyo Express supply run. This time, the Americans were the hunters, and they had the element of surprise. Or so they thought. The American plan was sound. Their destroyers, leading the formation, would use radar to detect the Japanese force, close to an optimal firing position, and launch a massive torpedo salvo before the enemy even knew they were there. The cruisers would then follow, opening up with their main guns to finish off the crippled Japanese ships. The trap was perfectly set. The radar did its job, picking up the line of 8 Japanese destroyers. The American destroyers surged forward to take up their firing positions. But then came a moment of fatal hesitation that would doom the American force. The destroyer commander, adhering to rigid protocol, requested permission to launch torpedoes. For 4 agonizing minutes, as the perfect tactical window began to close, he waited for the flagship's approval. By the time the order was finally given, the optimal position had been lost. Nevertheless, the American destroyers unleashed a volley of 20 Mark 15 torpedoes. It was a formidable salvo, enough to wipe out the entire Japanese column. Yet, as the torpedoes raced toward their targets, they accomplished nothing. Every single one either missed or failed to detonate. The Americans had played their hand and come up empty. The Japanese, alerted by the American maneuvers, reacted with the lightning speed and precision born of relentless training. Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka, a master of night combat, ordered a sharp turn away, simultaneously launching his own counterattack. A wall of torpedoes, 44 Type 93s, was unleashed into the dark, aimed not at the nimble American destroyers, but at the larger, more valuable targets they knew were following behind, the cruiser line. The American cruisers, sailing blindly into a kill zone they could not see, were about to pay a horrific price for their destroyer's failure. The invisible long lances, running deep and traceless, found their marks with chilling accuracy. The USS Minneapolis was struck, its bow nearly sheared off. The USS New Orleans suffered an identical fate moments later. Then the USS Pensacola was hit and set ablaze. The last ship in the line, the heavy cruiser USS Northampton bore the brunt of the final wave. 2 long lances slammed into her hull, tearing open her engine rooms. The effect was catastrophic. As one survivor later recalled, flaming oil spread over the ship, she was taking on water fast and began to list. For 3 agonizing hours, her crew fought heroically to save her, but the damage was too great. The Northampton was abandoned and slipped beneath the waves. The evacuation was a testament to the crew's discipline. Despite the violence of the attack and the chaos of a sinking ship at night, casualties were kept to a minimum. The battle was a tactical disaster for the United States. In exchange for sinking a single Japanese destroyer, the Takanami the U.S. Navy had lost 1 heavy cruiser and had 3 others so severely damaged they would be out of the war for nearly a year. In a poignant epilogue to the tragedy, a group of 40 survivors from the Northampton spent the entire night adrift in rescue floats. As dawn broke, their rescuer appeared on the horizon, a small, unassuming torpedo boat designated PT-109. 5 months later, that same boat would receive a new commander, a young lieutenant with a promising future, John F. Kennedy. By the summer of 1943, the U.S. Navy had been fighting in the Solomon Islands for nearly a year, paying for every blood-soaked mile in twisted steel and sailors' lives. Yet, they still operated under a series of dangerous assumptions about their enemy's capabilities. That was about to change. The night of July 6, 1943, during the Battle of Kula Gulf, would provide the final, brutal lesson that could no longer be ignored. The classroom was the light cruiser USS Helena Dash, a veteran ship famous for its incredible rate of fire, and the lesson would be fatal. Engaged in a furious gunnery duel with Japanese destroyers, the Helena's crew was performing with practiced lethality. The roar of her own 15 6-inch guns was a continuous, deafening thunder, spitting out shells at such a rate that her gun barrels glowed cherry red in the darkness. The ship was a whirlwind of controlled chaos, every man focused on the singular task of destroying the enemy. At 2:03, an unseen force of unimaginable power struck the ship's bow. It was a long lance, fired from an incredible distance. In one of the most surreal and tragic ironies of naval warfare, the crew of the Helena Dash, completely consumed by the cacophony of their own offensive barrage, did not even notice the moment of their ship's demise. The torpedo's impact was swallowed by the greater noise of the battle. But the damage was catastrophic. The entire bow of the warship, from its tip all the way back to the massive, armored barbette of the second main gun turret, was simply gone, sheared off and sent to the bottom of the Pacific. The ship was mortally wounded, yet her guns continued to fire. 2 minutes later, at 2:05, a second long lance slammed into the Helena's midsection, near the 82nd frame. This impact was impossible to ignore. It struck deep within the cruiser's vitals, ripping through the hull and destroying the main engineering spaces. The lights flickered and died. The thunder of the gun ceased, replaced by the terrifying shriek of escaping steam and the groan of a dying ship. The vessel's main power plant was obliterated, and the Helena went dead in the water, broken and helpless. On the bridges of the surviving American ships, disbelief warred with the horrific reality unfolding before them. The Japanese destroyers were visible, but they were far away, so far, in fact, that a torpedo attack should have been impossible according to every manual and every piece of intelligence the U.S. Navy possessed. The immediate, logical conclusion, broadcast between ships in frantic radio messages, was that the Helena had been attacked by a submarine lurking unseen between the two battle lines. It was the only explanation that made sense within their established framework of naval technology. But the sinking of the Helena was different from the losses that had come before. It was a piece of a horrifying puzzle that was finally snapping into place. Too many ships had been lost to invisible strikes. Too many battles had turned into inexplicable disasters. This event, witnessed by multiple ships during a running gun battle where enemy positions were known, forced the American command to confront a terrifying possibility they had long dismissed as improbable propaganda, that the Japanese possessed a surface-launched torpedo with a range and potency far beyond anything in the Allied arsenal. While the final, definitive proof would have to wait until after the war when Japanese documents and weapon remnants could be analyzed, the night of July 6, 1943, was the moment of intellectual surrender. The submarine theory began to crumble under the weight of accumulating evidence, and the dawning, chilling realization of the truth began to take its place. The secret of the long lance was, for all practical purposes, finally out. The theoretical capabilities of the Type 93 were staggering on paper, but it was in the crucible of combat that the weapon truly cemented its legendary status. It achieved feats of long-range destruction that bordered on the unbelievable, strikes so precise and from such extreme distances that they seemed impossible even to the highly skilled Japanese crews who launched them. These record-setting shots represent the absolute apex of torpedo warfare, a standard of performance that remains unmatched to this day. The first of these legendary shots occurred during the chaotic Battle of the Java Sea on February 27, 1942. In a confused melee involving a multinational Allied fleet and a powerful Japanese force, the heavy cruiser, Haguro, acquired a target, the Dutch destroyer HNLMS Kortenair Dash. From a distance that would have been considered utterly absurd by any other navy in the world, a staggering 22,000 yards, or over 12 nautical miles, the Haguro launched a spread of its long lances. For a torpedo to travel such a distance and find its mark required a perfect storm of masterful calculation, a measure of luck, and a weapon of unparalleled capability. The Courtenaire dash, maneuvering in the heat of battle, was struck amidships by one of these nearly invisible projectiles and broke in two, sinking in less than a minute. To the Allied command, her loss was just another tragic mystery in a disastrous battle, likely attributed to a stray shell or a mine. If the Java Sea shot could have been dismissed as a one-in-a-million fluke, the events of July 5, 1943, the night before the Battle of Kula Gulf, proved it was a repeatable, tactical capability. The Japanese destroyer, Miyazuki Dash, acting as the flagship for a Tokyo Express run, detected an American task force on its radar. From a range estimated to be, once again, around 22,000 yards, the Miyazuki fired a salvo. Its target was the American destroyer USS Strong Dash. The torpedo ran its silent, unseen course for many minutes across the dark water before slamming into the Strong Dash, inflicting a fatal wound. The American destroyer sank quickly, its sinking once again baffling the American commanders who believed they were well outside of torpedo range. These two torpedo strikes, fired from a distance of roughly 22 kilometers, stand to this day as the longest-range successful torpedo attacks in the history of naval warfare. They were not just lucky shots, they were the ultimate validation of Japan's asymmetrical naval strategy. But these record-breaking single shots were merely the highlights of a relentless campaign of destruction waged by the Long Lance. They were the exclamation points in a brutal narrative. Over the course of the war, the Type 93 claimed a confirmed tally of 22 Allied warships. The grim ledger includes 8 cruisers and 10 destroyers, the very backbone of the Allied surface fleets in the Pacific. Perhaps its most strategically significant victim, however, was the fleet aircraft carrier USS Hornet Dash, crippled by aircraft at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands and later finished off by Japanese destroyers firing Type 93 torpedoes. The Long Lance was not just a technological marvel that could achieve impossible shots, it was a brutally effective ship killer that fundamentally shaped the outcome of the savage surface battles in the Pacific. In the face of repeated, inexplicable losses, the U.S. Navy found itself fighting not just a determined human enemy, but a technological phantom. The inability to identify the source of the devastating torpedo attacks created an intelligence vacuum, and into that void rushed a torrent of speculation, rumor, and outright fantasy. On the mess decks and in the flag plots of the Allied fleet, sailors and officers alike struggled to make sense of a weapon that defied all known laws of their profession. This led to the birth of a catalog of false explanations, each one a testament to how completely the Japanese had concealed the truth of the Long Lance. One of the most persistent and technologically imaginative theories was that the Japanese had perfected an invisible, radio-controlled torpedo. This explanation seemed to account for the weapon's uncanny accuracy and its ability to strike from over the horizon. The idea of a torpedo guided by an unseen hand, correcting its course in the final moments to ensure a kill, was more plausible to many than the notion of a simple, unguided fish traveling for over 10 miles through open water to find its target. This theory gained traction because it fit a narrative of Japanese technical cunning, albeit in a direction they had not actually pursued. Another set of theories focused not on the weapon itself, but on its delivery system. Since surface ships were known to be incapable of such long-range torpedo strikes, the attacks had to be coming from a hidden platform. This gave rise to widespread rumors of secret Japanese mini-submarines, ghostly attackers that could slip undetected through destroyer screens, fire their torpedoes, and vanish. Some officers took this speculation even further, seriously entertaining the existence of advanced Japanese super submarines, with capabilities far beyond anything Allied intelligence had ever conceived. These phantom submersibles became a convenient scapegoat for every cruiser that exploded in the night. In the waters of Iron Bottom Sound, where so many ships met their end, the theory of unidentified minefields was particularly popular. It seemed logical that the Japanese, with their intimate knowledge of the local channels, had secretly sown the sea lanes with powerful, undetectable mines. This explained why ships seemed to explode without warning in the middle of a battle, even when no enemy was apparently in range. It was a comforting explanation, in a way, as it attributed the losses to a static, passive threat rather than to the active, terrifying superiority of an enemy weapon system. Perhaps most tellingly, a significant portion of the blame was directed inward. Faced with the enemy's impossible success, many American sailors and officers pointed to the notorious failures of their own equipment. The American Mark 15 torpedo was plagued with problems. It ran too deep. Its magnetic detonator was faulty, and its contact exploder often failed. It was easy, therefore, to project this unreliability onto the broader situation. Perhaps the explosions weren't enemy torpedoes at all, but catastrophic malfunctions of their own munitions, or even the result of dud American torpedoes being struck by shellfire. These were not merely the wild theories of shell-shocked sailors. The Allies were so completely in the dark that they were actively developing these fantastical explanations to rationalize their losses. The common thread uniting all these myths was a fundamental refusal to accept the simple, devastating truth, that the Japanese heavy cruisers and destroyers they could see on the horizon were, in fact, the source of the attacks. The reality, that the enemy possessed a conventional weapon with unconventional performance, was so far outside their tactical and technological paradigm that it was easier to believe in radio-controlled weapons, super submarines, and ghost fleets than to confront the terrifying prowess of the Long Lance. For over a year, the Allied naval command in the Pacific had been haunted by a phantom. They had lost ship after ship to an invisible enemy, attributing the carnage to everything from secret minefields to technologically impossible submarines. But by 1943, the weight of the evidence could no longer be ignored or explained away by fanciful theories. The moment of truth did not arrive in a single, dramatic revelation on a command bridge, but rather through the slow, methodical work of battlefield forensics and intelligence analysis. The mystery of the Long Lance was finally unraveled, piece by salvaged piece. The breakthrough came from the debris of battle. As the Allies slowly gained the upper hand in the Solomons, they began to secure Japanese positions and recover wreckage from sunken vessels. For the first time, intelligence officers had access to physical evidence, fragments of the mysterious torpedoes pulled from the shattered hulls of their own ships, and, crucially, intact examples recovered from captured enemy supplies or beached Japanese destroyers. Along with this physical evidence came captured Japanese documents, technical manuals, and prisoner interrogations that began to paint a coherent, if terrifying, picture. When the torpedo fragments and captured units were examined by Allied technical experts, the findings were stunning. They confirmed the existence of a massive, 24-inch torpedo, but the true revelation lay in its propulsion system. The engineers discovered the intricate network of pipes and valves that confirmed the unbelievable: the Japanese were using pure, compressed oxygen as a fuel oxidant. This was the key that unlocked the entire mystery. An oxygen-fueled engine explained the incredible range, the devastating speed, and, most importantly, the lack of a visible wake. The ghost had been identified. The invisible torpedo was real. This confirmation sent a shockwave through the U.S. Navy's command structure. The revelation rendered much of their existing tactical doctrine for night combat obsolete, if not suicidal. American intelligence was forced into a complete and urgent re-evaluation of its approach. Every Japanese cruiser and destroyer, previously assessed primarily on its gunnery, now had to be treated as a long-range torpedo platform of immense lethality. Engagement envelopes were redrawn overnight. The old rules of closing with the enemy were thrown out, replaced by a new, cautious doctrine that prioritized staying outside the Long Lance's newly discovered, and horrifyingly long, reach. But this moment of clarity was profoundly and tragically belated. The truth had been uncovered, but only after the Long Lance had already carved a path of destruction through the Allied fleet. The cruisers lost at Savo Island, the Northampton at Tassafaronga, the Helena at Kula Gulf. The knowledge came too late to save them. The U.S. Navy had paid for its education in blood. The fleet of late 1943 and beyond would fight with a new and sober understanding of the threat, but this was a lesson learned on the graves of the ships and sailors lost in 1942. The success of the Long Lance was, in the end, a testament to the astonishing effectiveness of Japanese secrecy. Their security surrounding the weapon was so absolute that even when Allied forces began to find physical evidence, the truth was difficult to fully comprehend. The concept of a reliable, mass-produced oxygen torpedo was so foreign to Western naval thought, which had abandoned such research as too dangerous, that the evidence was almost resisted. This intellectual blind spot, born of technological arrogance, allowed the Japanese to keep their most potent secret hidden in plain sight, long after the weapon had been unleashed in battle. The mystery was finally solved, but not before the Long Lance had already earned its place as the most devastating naval weapon of the Pacific War. The Type 93 torpedo was a weapon of immense power, a marvel of engineering that gave the Imperial Japanese Navy a decisive edge in the savage night battles of the Pacific. But this power came at a terrible price. The very element that gave the Long Lance its incredible performance, pure, compressed oxygen, also made it a profoundly dangerous and unstable weapon, not just for the enemy, but for the very men who wielded it. The Long Lance was a double-edged sword, and its presence aboard a Japanese warship was a constant, volatile threat. The danger was inherent in its design. The use of pure oxygen as a propellant created what was, in effect, a massive, tube-shaped fuel air bomb housed on the deck of a warship. Any mishandling during the complex and delicate process of transport, maintenance, or loading could lead to a catastrophic accident. A leaky valve, a contaminated fuel line, or a sudden shock from a nearby explosion could be enough to trigger a detonation. Japanese sailors, with a mixture of reverence and dread, referred to it as the weapon of the god of war, a nickname that perfectly captured their awe at its power and their deep-seated fear of handling the onboard arsenal. Every torpedo was a sleeping dragon, and the crews had to tread very carefully not to wake it. This inherent danger was not merely a theoretical risk, it was a horrifying reality that manifested itself in the heat of battle. The most devastating example occurred during the Battle off Samar on October 25, 1944. The Japanese heavy cruiser, Suzuya-, part of the powerful center force, came under a ferocious attack from American carrier aircraft. During the assault, a bomb strike, not a direct hit on the torpedo tubes, but a near miss that caused a violent shock and started fires, was enough to set off a chain reaction. The ship's own Type 93 torpedoes, stored in their deck-mounted launchers, detonated. The resulting explosion was apocalyptic, tearing the Suzuya apart from the inside out. The very weapon designed to kill enemy cruisers had, in the end, killed its own. The commanders of Japanese warships were acutely aware of this onboard threat. The fear of a ship's own torpedoes causing its destruction was a constant factor in their tactical decision-making. It became a standard, if desperate, operating procedure for Japanese captains to jettison their entire complement of Long Lances if their ship was heavily damaged, on fire, or in imminent danger of being sunk or captured. They would rather send their prized weapons to the bottom of the ocean than risk having them detonate and hasten the ship's demise. The sight of dozens of these multi-ton weapons being unceremoniously dumped over the side was a clear admission that the god of war's weapon was often too dangerous to keep. For the Japanese sailors who served on these ships, victory and annihilation were separated by the thinnest of steel plating. For all its terrifying prowess and the myths it spawned in the heat of combat, the weapon that haunted the Allied fleet in the Pacific never actually had a name that captured its fearsome reputation. During the war, its operators knew it by its formal designation, the Type 93, or more commonly by its technical description, Sanso Jirai-, simply, the oxygen torpedo. The evocative and now legendary moniker by which it is universally known, the Long Lance, was not the product of a Japanese naval committee or the terrified whispers of American sailors. It was coined years after the war had ended, by the very man tasked with chronicling the conflict from the American perspective. That man was Samuel Eliot Morison, a distinguished Harvard historian and passionate sailor. As the United States plunged into World War II, Morison recognized a unique historical opportunity. He believed that the story of the U.S. Navy's role in the global conflict needed to be told not from dry, after-action reports, but with the visceral immediacy of first-hand experience. He took his audacious proposal directly to the top, to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, himself a former Assistant Secretary of the Navy. In a now famous anecdote that captures his unique approach, Morison proposed himself as a naval historiographer. He argued to Roosevelt that the histories of past wars were often lifeless because they were written by academics poring over documents long after the fact. To do this right, Morison declared, "I must have a living, intimate connection with the fleet during the war." Roosevelt, a man who appreciated both history and bold initiative, agreed. In 1942, the 55-year-old Harvard professor was commissioned directly into the U.S. Naval Reserve with the rank of lieutenant commander and given unprecedented access to the fleet, its records, and its personnel. He would go on to serve on 11 different ships, witness 7 major battles, and rise to the rank of Rear Admiral. It was in the course of writing his monumental 15-volume History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, that Morrison was confronted with the challenge of describing the Type 93 torpedo. He needed a term that would convey to his post-war readers the weapon's revolutionary nature, its incredible reach, its speed, and its devastating impact. It was a weapon that struck like a spear from a distance previously thought impossible. Drawing on this imagery, Morrison christened it the Long Lance. The name was a stroke of literary genius. It was memorable, evocative, and perfectly encapsulated the tactical advantage the torpedo provided, allowing Japanese ships to strike from far outside the range of their opponents, much like a knight with a lance could outreach a swordsman. The term Long Lance was so fitting that it was immediately adopted by other historians and veterans, and it quickly became the weapon's universally accepted name. The legend of the torpedo and the name given to it by the American historian who documented its reign of terror became inextricably intertwined. The story of the Type 93 Long Lance is more than just the chronicle of a superior piece of military hardware. It is a profound and tragic lesson in the dangers of technological arrogance and the catastrophic consequences of underestimating an adversary. In retrospect, it is clear that the Long Lance was not an invincible superweapon, but rather a tool that proved devastatingly effective within a unique and fleeting set of circumstances that existed in the early years of the Pacific War. Its unparalleled success was as much a product of American weaknesses as it was of Japanese strengths. This deadly synergy was built on 3 core pillars. First was the paradoxical gap in observation technology. The U.S. Navy entered the war confident in its new, miraculous radar, but the early sets were primitive, unreliable, and required highly skilled operators to interpret their ghostly flickers. The Japanese, by contrast, had invested in a different kind of technology, the human eye. Their lookouts were rigorously selected and subjected to relentless, fanatical training, transforming them into nocturnal predators who could spot a ship's silhouette in the darkest of nights, long before the Americans could get a clear radar return. Second was the vast disparity in experience. The American fleet, rapidly expanding to meet the demands of a two-ocean war, was filled with inexperienced crews and, 90-day wonder, officers learning their trade in the crucible of combat. They were pitted against Japanese cruiser and destroyer divisions that had trained together as cohesive units for years, practicing the intricate choreography of night torpedo attacks until it was second nature. Finally, there was the chasm in tactical doctrine. American naval thought was rigid and gun-centric, viewing torpedoes as secondary weapons for close-in brawls. The Japanese, however, had built their entire night battle strategy around the Long Lance, developing bold and flexible tactics designed to maximize its incredible range and stealth. They were masters of a deadly art for which the Americans were almost completely unprepared. Imagine, then, an American admiral in the quiet, reflective years after the war. The din of battle has faded, replaced by the rustle of papers in a Washington, D.C. office. Before him lies a recently declassified intelligence report, detailing the final, confirmed specifications of the Type 93 torpedo. He reads the numbers again, letting their stark reality sink in: a range of 44,000 yards, a speed of 36 knots, a 1,080-pound warhead. The cold data points connect in his mind to a ghostly roster of lost ships: Canberra, Quincy, Northampton, Helena. It is in this quiet moment that the full, crushing weight of understanding dawns. It wasn't ghosts or super submarines that had savaged his fleet. It was a piece of steel and explosive, wielded by a determined enemy they had never bothered to truly understand. The greatest weapon the Japanese possessed was not the torpedo itself, but the secret of its existence, a secret they guarded with lethal discipline. It is the ultimate, humbling lesson of the Long Lance. Secrets can indeed be kept until the weapon is revealed in battle.